Okay, so here we are for our first anatomy and physiology lecture. And normally I talk a little bit about myself, but thankfully you guys have already had my orientation, hopefully. And so you already know all about me, right? So anyway, but of course, again, you can see I love comparative anatomy. And I will try not to confuse you too much with some comparative anatomy, but it is really interesting when you start to look at the anatomy of the human body and then compare the similarities and the differences to different species of organisms. So one of my favorite hobbies, right? That's what we do in our spare time. It's comparative anatomy sometimes. So anyway, let's get on to some human anatomy. So let's dive in. So again, this chapter will be an introduction to the human body. And again, when we're talking about anatomy, of course, in this class, we are focused on the human anatomy because this is a human anatomy and physiology class. So we will focus on that, even though I might every once in a while bring in some comparative anatomy. Okay, so the purpose of this chapter is obviously to kind of introduce anatomy and physiology, what those terms mean and how they're related. We're going to consider how living things are organized and talk about why that organization is important. We will talk about the shared properties that all living things have in common. And then we're going to learn and understand some anatomical terminology. And this will hopefully not only allow you to navigate this class, this course, but also allow you to communicate kind of more accurately with your colleagues as you go into your healthcare careers or your health science professions. So again, learning this terminology is not just important for this class, but also, more importantly, it's important for your careers. And then we will talk about this theme called homeostasis. And you're going to see this theme in every chapter of the book. We're going to talk about how the body tries to maintain what we call this state of sameness. So remember, homeo is that term that means same, and stasis means the state of. So homeostasis literally means the state of sameness. And so it's going to be really important if you can start to kind of break down some of these words, and it's like learning a new language, right? Human anatomy and physiology is kind of its own language. And if you can learn the kind of parts to these words and what they mean, then it will help you navigate all the other terms. So if you know that homeo is the state, or homeo means same, and then stasis means the state of. So, or homo also means same. So homo means same, stasis means the state of. Then this means the state of sameness. So when we talk about that, we're talking about the body trying to maintain its internal conditions, right? And then we'll talk about how each of the body systems is designed to help you maintain that state of sameness, that homeostasis. So really quick, let's introduce the terms anatomy versus physiology. So anatomy is really more of the focus on studying just the structure of the body parts and then how they are related to one another. But of course, this structure that these body parts have is related, of course, to their function. We kind of use this term that we use in many biology courses that says that form fits function. So the structure, it's hard to talk about the anatomy, the structure of each body part, without talking a little bit about its function as well. Because the structure of that body part is the way that it is, probably because it fits some certain function by being structured that way. So the physiology, again, when we break up the actual terms, anatomy is really the study of the structure of those body parts, where physiology is really the study of the function of these body parts, how they work to carry out, again, all of these kind of life-sustaining activities that we have in the body. But again, they're kind of married. We can't talk about one without the other. Okay. And so I'll talk about that in just a minute in a further slide here. So we do have subdivisions of anatomy. So we have, of course, gross or macroscopic anatomy. So when we say gross anatomy, it's not talking about, disgusting, oh, gross. But even though you may find some parts of, the anatomy to be disgusting or gross, but we're not talking about that. Gross. When we say gross anatomy, that term means we're talking about the macroscopic, the large, the study of the large kind of visible structures. So when we, talk about this, oftentimes we're talking about organs and organ systems, more at that level. We don't need a microscope. Again, we can see these structures without a microscope. So we can talk about some system anatomy, where we might be like just looking at one system, like the organs of the cardiovascular system, or organs of the nervous system, like the brain and the spinal cord, or we might be talking about the muscular system and the muscles and naming the different muscles of the muscular system. And then we can also use surface anatomy to kind of look at some internal structures as they kind of relate to the overlying skin. So we can see certain veins like from the surface of the skin. We are going to identify certain veins, and there are certain ones that you would need to know for purposes of like venipuncture. And so you can identify those macroscopic veins from the surface of the skin. You don't even, have to look internally. So again, those are just, that's just one way that we break up anatomy, is by talking about the macroscopic, the gross anatomy. And then we also will talk about the microscopic anatomy, which is going to deal with the structures that are just too small for us to see with the naked eye. So we need, microscopes. So we're going to deal with things like cytology when we're looking at the microscopic study of the cells. And so this is important because, really to understand how these organs function. So in terms of how we can understand something like the kidneys and how the kidneys function, to produce urine as this waste product, we really have to understand what's going on at the cellular level inside those kidneys. And so again, we really need to look at the microscopic anatomy. So cytology is an important word to know, mainly because cyto is going to be one of those prefixes that we're going to use throughout both Bio 201 and Bio 202. So it's an important one. If you can learn it now, it will make your life much easier. So cyto means cells. So when we're going to talk about things like erythrocytes, that's going to be erythro is red. That's going to be a red blood cell. Okay, so cyte, that word cyte again means cell. Or if we're going to talk about osteoblasts and osteocytes, if we're talking about osteocytes, osteo means bone, cyte means cell. So we're talking about bone cells. So again, anytime that you hear the word cyte, I want you to think cell. And that way, then it'll just, again, make this terminology a little bit more manageable for you as we navigate through this very new language to you, right? So again, cytology is the microscopic study of cells. And so when we talk about each organ system, we're going to talk about the cells that are involved with that, making up that organ system. And then we'll also talk quite a bit about histology. So histo means tissues. Again, ology means the study of. So histology literally means, again, the study of tissues. And again, we need a microscope because the tissues aren't at the level that we can see with our naked eye. So this is the microscopic study of tissues. And so tissues just means that we have a group of cells that are all working together for a common function. And so that's our tissue level of organization. This group of cells that are all working together, the same types of cells all working together for a common function. And then we can also talk about developmental anatomy as like our third kind of subdivision. So we have the gross anatomy, macroscopic anatomy is our first, microscopic anatomy is our second subdivision, and then the third subdivision is developmental anatomy, which is kind of the study of the anatomical and physiological development that we have from, an embryo or and fetus on out to, an adult. And so this we won't focus on quite as much because you can actually do an entire course just on embryology. So again, embryology is the study of development before birth, and it's really interesting. We'll talk a little bit about this. We have one lecture that we dedicate to developmental anatomy, and we will talk about the development of a fetus in its very basic way. But there is a whole course. I actually got to take a whole course on embryology in college, and it was probably one of my favorite courses. Again, it was more comparative anatomy between our embryological development and, the embryological development of a fetal pig and, a starfish. And so it was just really interesting to see some of the similarities. I mean, there are similarities between our developmental phases as we start out as this little ball of cells. And we have a lot of similarities to a starfish that starts out, life the same way. So it's really kind of interesting when you look at some of the similarities. And then, of course, as you go on through the embryological development, then that's where you really get to see the differences in the processes. So anyway, interesting, but if you ever get a chance to take a developmental anatomy class, always a really interesting class to take. Okay, so to study anatomy in this course, you have to know some of your anatomical terminology. So that's the part of this course that's learning a new language. But you also need to be able to do a couple other things in terms of helping you really to remember this anatomy. And so anytime you can observe this anatomy on another person, and this is where really labs come in handy. And I know you guys are taking the lab online, but we have some lab kits, right, for you that you can actually do some hands-on activities with these labs. But anytime that you can observe this anatomy on, a friend of yours or, someone that maybe lives in your house and you're like, hey, can I just go through some anatomical terms on you real quick? It's one of the best ways that you can learn to do some of that active learning. Anytime you can manipulate even yourself. So as you're learning the different muscles and learning like what bones they move as they contract and how they move, do they, rotate your arm internally so again, we're going to talk about how you can actually do that. Will they flex your arm? Will they extend your arm? So again, it's really important if you can use your own body to kind of manipulate your body and see how some of these different anatomical features work. Also palpating, anytime you can feel something in yourself, maybe you want to palpate, your carotid pulse or something like that. That really will help you also to remember some of this anatomy. And then auscultation as well that's just listening, right? So you can auscultate your heartbeat or your lungs to hear, again, your lung function. So again, those are all ways in which you can use different ways that you can use to help learn some of these anatomical features. Subdivisions of physiology. So again, physiology is really that study of function. And this is, and a lot of times I know you'll hear people say, oh, well, Bio 201 is the anatomy, where 202 is the physiology. And that's not true. Both courses have anatomy and physiology in it. It's just that Bio 201 tends to be heavy in terms of the anatomy structures that you have to learn versus because we're starting with some organ systems that have lots of structures in them. But we talk about the physiology with both of them. So please don't think that we're not going to talk about physiology. You're going to get anatomy and physiology of each organ system in both courses. So both courses are going to have anatomy and physiology. So again, when we talk about physiology, we can focus on like the organ system at the organ system level. So we can talk about, renal physiology. That would be your, again, your like urinary system type physiology, or cardiovascular physiology. So you can focus on things at the organ system. But oftentimes with physiology, we're going to take things down and focus on the cellular and molecular levels. So what's going on. So as we look at something like the cardiovascular system, we might go down and look at the cellular level of the heart, and how do those cardiac cells beat, and what's going on in terms of at the molecular level, what's going on to make those cells be conductive, and what kinds of changes are we seeing in ions and things like that that are allowing that electrical conduction to occur. So we'll oftentimes, again, take our physiology down to the cellular and molecular levels to really understand how things are working and functioning. So to study physiology, again, you have to understand some kind of basic principles about electrical currents and pressures and movements. And we will talk about some of those basic chemical principles as we go throughout the semester. But it's also why we're going to have a short little reminder section on some basic chemistry for you, because it is important for understanding the physiology. So again, as you've heard me say already many, many times, you can't talk about anatomy without talking about physiology, and vice versa. So even though they mean different things, we kind of say they're inseparable because it's really hard to talk about one without the other. Your function is always going to be reflected in the structure. So for example, when we're talking about something like the intestines, right? And you look at, we haven't gotten there yet, so you don't have to know this, but we will get there, and we'll talk about something called the intestinal villi, these little finger-like structures, right? And you might be like, well, why does the inside of your intestine look like that? Why isn't it just flat? And so we'll talk about things like the fact that this really, increases all the surface area in the intestines by having these intestinal villi. So again, it's hard to just talk about intestinal villi without talking about why we have intestinal villi, which is the function. So again, we're really going to focus a lot this semester on form fits function. And this kind of helps actually to minimize your memorization, because it's easier to remember intestinal villi when you know why you have them. Okay. So again, form fits function. We're going to talk a lot about that. And so this is known as the principle of complementarity of structure and function. You don't need to know that. You just need to know the term. You don't need to know complementarity of structure and function. I just want you to know that form fits function, and anatomy and physiology are talked about in that way. Okay, so let's get on into some of the nitty-gritties and talk about structural organization. The human body is, of course, very well organized, from the smallest chemical level of organization all the way up to the whole organism. So we're going to talk about that. So we're going to talk about things at the chemical level, which is your atoms coming together to form molecules, like, molecules of water. So you have hydrogen and oxygen atoms coming together to form a water molecule. You have carbon and hydrogen atoms coming together, and oxygen atoms coming together to form, molecules of carbohydrates and things like that. And then we're going to talk about how these molecules, again, come together to form organelles. Okay, so that's all at our chemical level of organization. And remember, our organelles are like the organs of the cell. So just as a reminder, the organelles are things like the mitochondria and the endoplasmic reticulum and the Golgi apparatus. Remember all those things. And if you don't, we'll do a review on them. And then we get to the cellular level of organization, where we talk about single cells. So remember, your cell is kind of the basic structural and functional unit of each organism, right? Or the cell is the basic structure of life. If you were to break down cells, or to break down life as far as you can, okay, you would break it down to the cellular level, right? So tissue, then we're going to talk about things at the tissue level of organization. So when we have groups of similar cells all working together for a common function, we're at the tissue level of organization. And then when we take 2 or 3 types of tissues and put them together and make them all work together for a common function, we're at the organ level of organization. And then when we take, a couple organs, like we might take, the brain and the spinal cord and peripheral nerves and put them all together and make up the organ system, right? So organs that work closely together for a common function are at the organ system level of organization. And then we take all those organ systems combined together to make up and function together for the whole organism. So that's at the organismal level of organization. So again, here we talk about, we've got atoms combining together to form a molecule, okay? So those molecules might be something like phospholipids that make up, the membrane of the mitochondria, okay? And so those molecules come together to make up organelles, organs of the cell, right? Organelles. And then those organelles, oops, sorry, I skipped ahead to my organismal level there. Let me go back here. So we've got organelles, right, that are going to work together for the common function of a cell. So example, smooth muscle cell is going to have a nucleus. It's going to have mitochondria inside here. It's going to have endoplasmic reticulum. So again, those cells will have different organelles. Sorry, you can hear my dog growling in the background. I'm trying to quiet her so I don't have to re-record this. But so those organelles are going to all work together for a common function of the cell, right? So then we've got our smooth muscle cell here at the cellular level of organization. Now, if you take a bunch of these smooth muscle cells and you put them together, and they function together for a common function, we're at the tissue level of organization. So this is our smooth muscle tissue. Now, this smooth muscle tissue, okay, along with connective tissue and epithelial tissue, might all be put together to make up a blood vessel, okay? So now we've moved from the tissue level to the organ level of organization. So again, organs are going to be made up of different types of tissues. So this is a nice example of how all this comes together. And then, if we take our blood vessels and put it together with, the heart, we take all of our arteries and our veins, all those blood vessels, put them together along with the heart. This can make up the cardiac system, right? When we're talking about the organ level, so the cardiovascular system at the organ system level of organization now. Okay, and then we take the cardiovascular system, again, which consists of heart and blood vessels, and we put it together with, the nervous system, and we put it together with the endocrine system, and we put it together with all these other skeletal system, muscular system, put all those systems together, and now, of course, we are at the organismal level of organization. I just couldn't resist the cute baby there as the organismal level of organization. I mean, come on, right? So anyway, so that's how we break up life. Hopefully that was just kind of a review anyway, but that's how we break up life in terms of, or the human body as a whole into these different kind of levels of organization. So our next kind of review is to review what these major characteristics of life are, like what makes us a living organism, right? And so unlike Justice Potter Stewart, we can't just say, I know it when I see it, and so that's what life is. Unfortunately, that didn't go so well for him, if you know his whole kind of historical story on how he was this Supreme Court judge that made it a ruling on pornography and use the line, "This isn't pornography," because I know it when I see it. So just like that didn't work out so well for Justice Potter Stewart, it doesn't really work out well for us to just say, well, I know what life is because I know it when I see it. We really need to have these characteristics that help us to define what a living organism is. So let's talk about these necessary characteristics for life. Okay, what makes us a living organism? So the maintenance of life is going to involve things like maintaining boundaries. And so just like, in relationships, maintaining boundaries is important, right? It's also important in the human body as well. So we need to have this separation between the internal and the external environments, right? So we're going to have things like plasma membranes that separate cells from their external environment. And we're going to have things like our skin, right? That separates us as an organism, our internal environment from the external environment. So that's a necessary function of life, is to maintain boundaries. Also movement. So when we, are talking about movement of the human body, of course, we have the muscular system that allows our movement, right? So, we've got the skeletal muscles that will move bones and allow us to make these large macro movements. But, we also have movements, internally. So, for example, you might be digesting, breakfast or lunch or dinner, whenever you're watching, this video. And so you have smooth muscle contractions that are happening inside your digestive system to be able to contract and propel that food down to your stomach. Okay, so we'll talk about movements all throughout the body in terms of not just our macroscopic movements, but also movements on a much smaller scale as well. So let's see. Then we'll talk about necessary functions of life, responsiveness. So we have to have this ability to kind of sense our external environment and respond to certain stimuli that are going on in our external environment. So for example, you put your hand on a hot stove. You need this withdrawal reflex to prevent yourself from, totally burning your hand. Also, we need to be able to respond internally with changes. So for example, you start to run and your muscles are screaming for oxygen because you're running from the big scary bear. And so we need to be able to control our breathing rate and respond, right, to that new need for more oxygen to our tissues. So we have to be able to respond to changes in our external environment as well as our internal environment. And then our next requirement for life is digestion. And when we talk about digestion here, we're really talking kind of about breaking down molecules, ingested food, into simple molecules that basically can be absorbed and transported, right, throughout the blood. So that way then, of course, our ultimate goal here is to transport those usable simple molecules, right, to all the cells in the body. Okay, so that we can, again, maintain those cells and their functions. Then, of course, we can talk about metabolism. And when we talk about metabolism here, it's a little bit different than what you might think of when you're talking about, your metabolism. You might say, well, I have a good metabolism, or I don't have a great metabolism. But really, what we're talking about when we talk about metabolism in anatomy and physiology is all of the chemical reactions that occur in the body. So metabolism is the sum total of all of these chemical reactions that are occurring in your body. The breakdown ones, which are called the catabolic reactions. And we'll get it, I'll use these terms later on, but I'm just kind of introducing them now. And the building reactions called the anabolic reactions, okay? So our metabolism is our sum total of all the catabolic breakdown reactions and our building anabolic reactions. And then excretion, and of course we couldn't live without any of those chemical reactions. So metabolism, again, very important requirement for life. Excretion, also very important because of our metabolic reactions here, we're gonna have all of these waste products that occur from our chemical reactions. So for example, again, when we talk about the chemical reactions that we do like through the citric acid cycle to make ATP, right? We're gonna make carbon dioxide as a byproduct. And so we gotta get rid of that carbon dioxide because that carbon dioxide would become, basically toxic to our body if we kept it all in. So we need to expel these wastes. So removal of the wastes that are byproducts from metabolism and digestion is what we call excretion. So again, we'll remove things like urea, which is our breakdown from created from our breakdown of proteins. We'll do that through the urinary system. Again, carbon dioxide we got to get rid of. Feces, right, from the digestive system, our unabsorbed foods. So all good examples of why we need excretion. And then, of course, we have to do reproduction. So when we talk about reproduction, everybody thinks, about making babies, right? But when we talk about reproduction as a life function, we're also talking about this at like the cellular level of organization again. So your cells inside your body have to reproduce so that you can grow and repair, right? So they have to do things like mitosis. So that's one way in terms of talking about reproduction is at the cellular level of organization. Your cells have to go through mitosis to be able to produce new skin cells as you shed them, off. Or again, you have to be able, as you grow, you have to be able to, make new osteocytes so your bones can grow and things like that. So we'll talk about how those different processes occur as we go throughout the semester, but also, of course, we talk about reproduction at the organismal level, and that's going to result in the production of offspring. And that we won't get to till 202. So, but you will talk about reproduction in 202. We talk about it quite a bit. And then, of course, growth. So to be, again, a living organism, you have to increase in size, at least either as an organism or part of your body parts have to increase in size. So an increase in size of a body part or of the organism as a whole is growth. So again, we'll talk about that and things like the skeletal system in terms of how your bones grow and develop. Okay, so again, remember that humans are these multicellular organisms. So to function, these individual cells have to be kept alive. So it's kind of weird when you start to think about, well, like, why do I need to eat food? Okay, and so the reason that you eat food is that you can take that food in, break down those chemicals into kind of their individual simple molecules, so that those simple molecules can then be taken up and used by the individual cells in your body, so that those cells can then use those molecules to make energy for the cell, right? So that the cell can run on the energy, that the cell needs that energy to function. All of your cells do. So again, most of the functions that occur in the human body based upon our organ systems are to keep these cells alive, to keep our individual cells alive. So again, organ systems are designed to service these cells, to take care of all of our cells. And all the cells depend on these organ systems to meet their basic survival needs. So there are 11 basic organ systems that work all together to maintain life. And, this is just kind of an example of the interrelationship among body organ systems and how they work together. So when we talked about, here, all of our cells, right, need to be serviced. So they all need nutrients. So, as we take food in and break down through the digestive system those macronutrients into these micronutrients that can be absorbed into the bloodstream. Then we need the cardiovascular system, right, to share those nutrients throughout the body. And then we can talk about, again, the respiratory system will also bring oxygen because we need oxygen to make ATP as well, if you remember, as our final electron receptor. I know you guys are hating me for that right now, but remember that oxygen is that final electron acceptor when our cells are making ATP. So we need that as well. So that needs to be taken into our bloodstream and spread out to these cells throughout the body. So again, these organ systems all have to work together to keep these basic cells alive. And so we're going to really briefly talk about, introduce what these organ systems are and their really basic functions. Again, please remember that we're going to go through, right? This is all of 201 and 202. We're going to go through each of these organ systems in detail. So right now, what we want you to do is just have the big picture, really big overview of what the function of each organ system is, okay? So first we'll talk about the integumentary system. And this is gonna, again, form a nice external body covering for us. So this is important, again, for maintaining our boundaries, right? Protecting us from the external environment and allowing our internal environment, right, to be maintained. So again, that's the integumentary. The skin is actually one of the organs. These are all organs of the integumentary system. So skin, hair, nails, and we'll talk about this as we get into the integumentary system. But and so they're all going to help protect, some of our deeper tissues from getting injury, from retaining an injury. Also, our integumentary system is important for, as you guys probably know, making vitamin D. That's right. You're supposed to go outside and get some sun. Maybe you need to do that today. Get 10 minutes of sun so you can make some vitamin D within your skin. So again, really important for some of these other kind of accessory functions that we have for the integumentary system. Also, our integumentary system houses certain cutaneous receptors, things like pain receptors, right? So, if you touch a hot stove, thank goodness we have pain receptors in your skin that will say, hey, pull your hand away right away. So again, also pressure receptors so that you can feel when someone's pushing on you. And then we also have, of course, glands, things like sweat and oil glands that help. Those sweat glands can help us maintain our body temperature by cooling us down, doing evaporative cooling and things like that. Then we have the skeletal system, which really, when you think of the skeletal system, you probably think of protection, support, framework, right? Those are kind of the big words that you should clue you into a skeletal system. Again, it protects, like when you think of the rib cage, protects, things like the lungs and the heart, right? Also supports body organs, as well as provides this framework by which we can move our body. Because if you think about it, if you didn't have a skeletal system, you just had muscles, then the muscles wouldn't have really anything to move. Because when your muscles are contracting, they're contracting to pull, two bones closer together or farther apart. So it's really important that we have those bones. Otherwise, muscle contraction wouldn't really get us anywhere. It would just be this, gelatinous structure. So also, you might not always think about this right away, but your blood cells are actually made in your bone marrow. So really important for, bones are important for, making blood cells. So kind of a function that you might not think of for your skeletal system. And then, of course, bones are going to be a good storage for minerals, things like, calcium deposits. But there are also other ions that are stored in your bone as well. Muscular system. So again, muscular system's, of course, going to allow you to kind of manipulate your environment. It allows you to move yourself. It allows you to do facial expressions. So, if you're disgusted by all this anatomy right now, it allows you to give me this nice disgusted look that unfortunately I can't see because I don't have you in the classroom. But, the one downside of being able to do the online. But of course, then the upside is you can give me those disgusted looks, and of course I can't see them. So, but you can do that thanks to your muscular system. And then, of course, it helps you to maintain posture. You know, without your muscular system, you couldn't stand up, you couldn't hold your head up. And then you might not think about it, but your muscular system also produces heat. Every time your muscles contract, it produces heat and helps you to maintain your body temperature. Nervous system. So your nervous system and your endocrine system, we're going to talk about as being the control systems. And so when you talk about how they're a little bit different, the nervous system is kind of like your direct control. So it's kind of like the wired system to be able to give direct control to contracting your muscles. And things like that. Where when we talk about the endocrine system has kind of more of an indirect control. It's going to control certain organ functions by releasing hormones that will impact those organs. So a little bit of a different way in which, you know, the nervous system will directly impact those organs. By, again, you know, sending electrical conduction to those organs, okay? Versus the endocrine system will do this through releasing hormones into the bloodstream that will then travel to that organ and then induce a change in that organ. Or cause it to, you know, produce a certain chemical, or cause it to contract, or cause it to, do a certain function. So these are really the two control systems. So nervous system, again, is the fast-acting control system, and it can respond to stimuli from the outside, as well as internal changes, and then activate the appropriate muscles and glands, where, again, the endocrine system is going to do this all through secreting hormones. So it'll secrete hormones that can regulate things like growth, reproduction, metabolism, things like that. The cardiovascular system is our big transport system, right? So it's where you're going to have your blood vessels that are going to transport blood, which is going to carry things like nutrients to all of your cells in the body, oxygen. It's going to carry away waste products like carbon dioxide, and nitrogenous wastes. So again, cardiovascular system is really our major transport highway for the body, if you can think of it that way. Lymphatic system. So your lymphatic system is going to kind of pick up all these fluids that were leaked out from your blood vessels. So when your blood vessels, right, are bringing nutrients and oxygen and all that throughout the body, they're not just, you know, throwing out these nutrients, but those nutrients are going to leak out with fluids that are going to leak into the interstitial spaces around those cells. And so that fluid, that extra fluid that leaks out that's not used, will actually be returned to the bloodstream by the lymphatic system. And as it does that, it does this kind of a little bit of surveillance, in that as it picks up that fluid, it's going to pick up things that are in that fluid. And so sometimes there are bacteria, sometimes there's debris, like macrophages and things like that, part of the immune system that maybe have engulfed something and now are undergoing cell death. So they'll bring that in, and it allows the lymphatic system allows a little immune surveillance, okay? It also is going to house the white blood cells that are involved with immunity. So it's not going to make those. Now remember, that happens in the red bone marrow. So it's a little tricky when you talk about immune. There's not technically an immune system per se, because immunity comes from different systems. So when we talk about immunity, right, the lymphatic system is going to be involved, but also the skeletal system's involved, because the skeletal system houses the red marrow that's actually going to make our white blood cells. So, but the lymphatic system is going to house those white blood cells, and it will do it in things like lymph nodes and the spleen and some of its lymphatic organs. And then this allows that surveillance, allows the immune response to mount to full attack against these foreign invaders. So that's the lymphatic system and how it's involved with immunity. Respiratory system. The respiratory system, of course, is important for keeping this constant supply of oxygen. So again, remember that ultimately all your cells need oxygen. Again, is that, I know you're hating me right now, but that as that final electron acceptor to make ATP. So your cells can't make ATP without oxygen. So your cells would all die without oxygen, right? So we need that oxygen. All of your cells need that oxygen. And then, of course, as a byproduct of those chemical reactions involved, like in the citric acid cycle, if you can remember that, we pump out carbon dioxide as a waste product. So that carbon dioxide, again, cannot be allowed to build up in our bloodstream. It would become toxic, so we have to get rid of that. So the respiratory system is really responsible for the gaseous exchange that happens through the walls of the air sacs of the lungs, and also between the bloodstream and the lungs, right? So we have to have gases going back and forth between the bloodstream and the lungs. Digestive system, of course, is all about breaking food down into kind of the simple molecules that can be used by our cells, okay? And so again, we're going to break that food down, and then it will be carried to our cells through the bloodstream. Oh, and then, of course, we also have to talk about that very important part of eliminating our feces, right? Our undigested food. So, and then the urinary system is going to eliminate all of our nitrogenous waste, which happen because of our breakdown, the metabolic processes that we have that break down proteins. So they produce, when we go through this metabolic process of breaking down proteins, we produce nitrogenous waste, and again, that would become toxic in our bodies if it was allowed to be, built up. So we eliminate that through the urinary system. But the urinary system also helps to regulate our water balance. It also helps to regulate our electrolyte balance. And we, of course, in 202, will talk quite a bit about how this does this. We're talking about electrolytes here. No, it's not just your basic Gatorade electrolyte, solution here. What makes that an electrolyte solution is that it has certain salts in it that are important for things like muscle contraction. So the urinary system really helps us to regulate those electrolytes like sodium and potassium, things like that. And then it also helps to act as an acid-base balance of the blood. And then, of course, we've got the reproductive system. So we've got the male reproductive system and the female reproductive system, again, which we're really going to talk mostly about in 202. And what's interesting is we talk about all these other systems, right, are really about maintaining homeostasis within the human body. And this system, the reproductive system, is the one system that's really not as involved with maintaining homeostasis in the body. It's really about, right, reproduction and making a new individual. So it's the one system that's really not about focused on homeostasis. Again, the focus here is, of course, in the production of offspring, okay? So again, in the males, we have testes to produce its gametes, sperm. In the females, we have ovaries that will produce her gametes. So the major reproductive organs, the major sex organs might not be the ones that you think of. The major sex organs are actually the ones that make up the gametes. So testes make the gametes in males, So here's our testes, again, makes the gametes in males, ovaries make the gametes in females, the eggs. And so again, the reproductive system will be all about how we produce those gametes, the process that goes into producing those gametes, and then how the female reproductive system, how those organs can support fetal life before birth, and then even into after birth when we talk about mammary glands. So again, just kind of a quick overview of the basics of each of those organ systems. So again, when we talk about survival needs, humans need several factors, right, for survival in the appropriate amounts. Too much or too little of these survival needs can be harmful. So again, we're going to need nutrients, we need oxygen, we need water, we need to maintain a normal body temperature and the appropriate atmospheric pressure. So we'll talk about each of these survival needs, right? Nutrients at its most basic level, right? We need these chemicals for energy and cell building. So these are things like, remember, our carbohydrates, proteins, fats, things like nucleic acids, minerals, and vitamins. We need all of those nutrients for our cells to be able to carry out their functions of life. Of course, again, we need oxygen. So again, the body can only survive just a few minutes without oxygen, and that's because that oxygen is that final electron acceptor for our cells to make ATP. So without oxygen, our cells can't make the energy they need to function, and then they start to die. Of course, we need water. So this is water is the most abundant chemical in our body, right? We are mostly these bags of water, if you would consider ourselves that. And we need this watery environment for chemical reactions to take place, to be able to transport chemicals, nutrients, oxygen, things like that. Also, all of our secretions are fluid-based. So when we're secreting, again, oils from our sebaceous gland, there's water in that. We're secreting sweat to be able to do evaporative cooling. There's water in that. So again, water obviously is so important to our survival that we can live much longer without food than we can without water. You know, you can only go a very short time without water. Normal body temperature. If the body temperature happens to go above or below 37 degrees Celsius, which is kind of our average body temperature, then the rates of chemical reactions that are happening in your body will be affected. So again, you know, if the temperature goes too far above 37 degrees Celsius and the chemical reactions are happening so fast, or if it goes way below 37 degrees Celsius, then the chemical reactions are happening so slowly that your cells aren't able to carry out all their functions. So again, that's why we carry out normal body temperature. And this ultimately, again, you're going to hate me for this, I know, because I'm going to bring you right back to the chemistry. And this ultimately is due to the fact that all of our metabolic reactions inside our bodies have enzymes, right? Those enzymes are what speed up those reactions to make them happen at the rate that we need them to happen. Otherwise, they would happen way too slow. So every single chemical reaction in your body has an enzyme with it. And those enzymes are very temperature specific. They're also specific to certain pHs and things like that. So that's why we want to maintain a normal body temperature. And then we also need to maintain the appropriate atmospheric pressure. So we're going to need specific pressures of air that are going to be adequate for us to be able to breathe and have this pressure gradient so that we're actually allowed to bring air in the lungs, okay, and exchange gases. So that appropriate atmospheric pressure is going to be very important as well. Okay, So now we can finally get into this term that we talked about in the very beginning of the lecture called homeostasis. And homeostasis, again, is simply, again, the state of sameness. So you have the term homo here, which would be same, and stasis, which is the state of. So homeostasis literally means, again, that state of sameness. It's, again, the maintenance of stable internal conditions despite changes in your environment. And again, we call this a dynamic state of equilibrium because, of course, your body is never like, it's not like always in perfect equilibrium, right? It's always got little changes happening, and it's on this kind of balance, and it always is kind of teetering a little bit back and forth as those changes are occurring. You know, your blood sugar goes up a little bit, and your body, has certain mechanisms to bring it back down to its normal level, okay? So you're always kind of teetering back and forth. And your organ systems are what allow you to maintain this balance. Your organ systems are all working really hard every day to allow you to maintain balance, to allow you to maintain an internal body temperature that's the same, to maintain internal glucose levels that are the same, to maintain certain ionic balances, all of these things. And so, again, these organ systems are all working together, and it's this balancing act. And again, there are many things that can throw this balancing act out of whack, including environmental changes, or it can be, an internal change, like you took a virus and it's, causing internal changes. And ultimately, if your organ systems are not able to restore balance, that's when, that those changes eventually would lead to death. Of course, this is over a span of time. It's not like instantly happening. You're like, oh my gosh, my body's out of whack. Okay, I'm, gone. Of course, that's not the case. We're talking about a massive, a massive failure in all your organ systems, again, will lead to death. So homeostasis is important, right? Homeostasis keeps us going. And there are different parts of these homeostatic controls. So we're going to talk about the kind of different parts. The body has to be constantly monitored, right? We have to have some type of way of monitoring when it's out of whack. And so the nervous system and the endocrine systems, as well as there are other monitoring systems as well. But those are the biggies that are going to play the major role in kind of maintaining our homeostasis. And then there are all different types of variables that have to be monitored. So, things like blood sugar, things like body temperature, blood volume, all those things are going to be variables that are constantly being monitored by the body. So homeostatic control of these variables is going to involve these three major components. There's a receptor, a control center, and an effector. And so a receptor is just our sensor, okay? And that sensor is going to monitor the environment and then respond to any external or internal changes. That's what we call a stimuli, things that cause changes. Then we're going to have a control center, and that control center is going to determine what our set point is for those variables. And that's going to receive input from the receptor. So if there is a change, it'll receive that input from that receptor and then determine what the appropriate response is to get us back to homeostasis, okay? So, and then the last part of this homeostatic control is our effector. So once again, the control center determines the appropriate response. The effector is going to carry out that response. So it receives the output from the control center, and then it provides a means of response. Okay, so, in this little case, they're just kind of giving you a basic example, but I like to use an anatomy, more anatomical example of this. So I'll give you an anatomical example of this in just a minute. But this just kind of shows you their idea of, the control center here, at kind of sensing and monitoring all those changes. And well, they don't even have sensor here, I guess. So, but you'd have a sensor. Oh, here's their sensor. Sorry. Here's their sensor detecting what the room temperature is. Control center decides when that temperature has changed and how to bring us back to that normal temperature. So that's kind of the basic idea of these homeostatic controls. But I'm going to give you some anatomical examples of this in just a minute. But really important here with the effector is that the response that occurs within the body is going to either reduce the stimulus, so whatever changed from homeostasis we were, okay? So for example, hold on, I am horrible. I try not to do this very often, but this is one of those times where it would be really helpful if I could be able to write on the screen. Where's my pen? Here it is. So please, I apologize now for my horrible screenwriting. But this one I'm not going to write any words, so it should be okay. So here's, let's say I can't even draw a straight line, but we'll pretend that this is a straight line and this is our homeostatic balance, okay? Now, if for some reason something throws this seesaw off up here, okay? Again, our sensor will detect that change. The control center will say, whoa, we're way off. And then our response is either going to be to bring us back down. So it's either going to reduce that stimulus. So that stimulus took us in this direction. It's going to reduce that stimulus and bring us back to homeostasis. That's a negative feedback mechanism. So negative feedback mechanisms bring us back to homeostasis. Or, so this is negative. I'm going to draw negative. Or if it's going to bring us farther in the direction of that change here, this is a positive feedback mechanism, okay? So as you can guess, the majority of the feedback systems in our body are which kind? Negative, right? Because we want to get back to homeostasis. But there are a couple systems, and as you can probably guess, reproductive being one of them, are systems where we want to further that change. So any women that have been pregnant know this, because at some point you have to, right, move that baby from its, internal position inside your uterus outside the body. So that's going to be where we're going to have a positive feedback mechanism. And I'll give you an example of that so that we get away from homeostasis, because at that point in time, our homeostasis is having that fetus in our uterus, but we don't want to have that fetus in our uterus forever, right? So eventually we have to expel that fetus, and that's the process of our positive feedback mechanisms. So again, not very common in the body. We have very few positive feedback mechanisms, but there are a few and they're important. But the majority of our feedback mechanisms, the vast majority of them, are going to be these negative feedback mechanisms, okay? Vast majority. Okay, so again, here's the seesaw, right? The balance, and of course, we have some type of, stimulus that takes us off balance here and produces a change in our variable. And then the receptor, of course, or sensor, receptor to sensor, whatever you want to call it, is going to detect that change. And then that change, that detection of that change is going to be sent to the control center, okay? That control center is then going to send output information to the effector, okay? And the effector will then, in a negative feedback situation, reduce the effect of that initial stimulus and bring us back to homeostasis, okay? So again, this is, of course, a negative feedback system, okay? This example right here is negative feedback. So again, if a response reverses the original stimulus, so the stimulus takes you here and the response reverses that back to homeostasis. So if you're going back to homeostasis, it's negative feedback. That's the easy question. Ask yourself, are you going back to homeostasis? If you are, it's negative feedback, okay? And most of our systems work this way. If a response does the opposite, if it enhances the original stimulus, so here is the original stimulus, and now, okay, your response to it takes you here farther away from homeostasis. That's a positive feedback mechanism, okay? So again, childbirth is one of these examples. I'm going to go through these examples. So again, homeostatic negative feedback mechanisms are going to be things like, okay, body temperature. So think about initially, if you go outside in Antarctica and it's cold, initially your body is going to, you've got skin receptors, right? And those skin receptors are going to be like, whoa, it is way cold out here, way colder than it is internally, right? So it's going to send that information to your brain, okay, which is going to be the control center. And then your brain is going to go, whoa, we need to do some things to warm up the body. So then the control center, your brain, is going to send out information through your motor neurons to tell your skeletal muscles to start to shiver, and they're going to start to contract rapidly. And when they do that, they're going to release heat as a byproduct. And that heat that's released internally from your muscles is going to help to bring you back to homeostasis, obviously to a degree, if you're standing outside, in Antarctica and you're in your skivvies, then, your body can only do so much, right? So, but it's trying to bring you back to homeostasis. So that's a negative feedback mechanism. Same if you're going outside in the 110-degree heat on a summer day and, it's so hot out, your skin sensors, again, are detecting that increase, that rise in temperature. It's sending information back to the control center of the brain, and the brain is saying, okay, all right, now we need to do some evaporative cooling. So then it sends information out again to your sweat glands that are going to release, again, that sweat to do evaporative cooling, okay? So those are some quick examples of negative feedback, okay? Also, the way in which we regulate blood glucose. So, for example, you eat a hamburger and you have a big rise in your blood glucose levels because you've taken that food, right? Break it down into glucose, and the glucose is released into your bloodstream. And as that blood glucose rises, it can become toxic. So what happens is then you have here this lovely organ called the pancreas that's going to release insulin. And that insulin is going to say, hey, liver, you need to take up some of that glucose and store it for a little while in this bigger complex molecule called glycogen. And so that will bring you back, right, to normal. So as your blood glucose level rises, insulin's released to bring your blood glucose back to normal, okay? So again, those are just some examples of negative feedback loops. And those are all the examples I just kind of talked about there. So then we have these positive feedback loops. And again, these are much less common, but obviously, again, as we talked about, the response that occurs is going to enhance or exaggerate that original stimulus. And so some examples of this are labor. So as the baby moves farther down, I'll talk about this here. So here's childbirth. Childbirth is a perfect example of a positive feedback mechanism. So and those of you that have been through labor, this positive feedback mechanism you have experienced is, it's quite effective and unfortunately not the most fun of the positive feedback mechanisms, but it does the job, right? So as the baby moves down the birth canal, this is going to stimulate the uterine contractions in mom. As the uterus contracts, right, it's going to push the baby down even further in the birth canal, which is going to stimulate more frequent and more intense contractions. So as you can see, the change here, right, is going to stimulate further than the response to that change is going to stimulate. So the change being that the baby moved down the birth canal, right? So there's your initial change. The response is the uterine contractions, which are going to move the baby even further down the birth control. So again, enhancing what the original stimulus had. So this is why it's a positive feedback mechanism. And again, of course, the reason that we have this positive feedback mechanism is that, the fetus can't stay within us forever. So it's a good thing that we have these positive feedback mechanisms. We also have some short-term positive feedback mechanisms. And so we talked about here, I think I have this up here, the platelet plug formation and blood clotting. When you have damage to a blood vessel. So, you have some type of cut or tear within your blood vessel wall, and there's a positive feedback cycle that's initiated where platelets are going to start to come in from the bloodstream, and they'll adhere to the site where there was a break or tear. And when they do that, they're going to release, there's certain chemicals that are released when these platelets actually attach to that site. And the release of those chemicals are actually going to call in more platelets. And so this positive feedback loop will continue eventually until we form what's called a platelet plug. And when that platelet plug is formed, then there are some other chemicals that will be released that will, again, take us out of that feedback loop. So we will talk about that blood clotting process coming up when we do the chapter on blood. So we'll talk more about that. Okay, so here are some test questions for you, just to kind of see how well you are familiar with positive and negative feedback. Because it is really important that you understand positive and negative feedback, not just for 201, but also, I talk about it in 202. And so we kind of are just expecting that you remember positive and negative feedback when you get to 202. So a female becomes amenorrheic. That means, she stops her menstrual cycle when her body is deprived of food. So this can happen again in women if they are, or if for some reason they are going through a starvation period, or if they're actually, intentionally doing this to themselves. But if, for some reason you didn't have food available, maybe like you were in a situation like you were in Ukraine and you just couldn't get food, if something like that occurred, then when your body stores get low, in females, their menstrual cycle will stop. And so focus on your energy source, right? If you don't have enough, if you're not bringing in enough energy, right, to be able to maintain your own body, how would you be able to maintain a fetus, right? And so actually your body will stop its menstrual cycle because the process that initiates menstruation, which would be, sometimes ovulation, would be that your body can't, maintain a pregnancy right now. And it also can't afford to lose the energy source that it would lose with getting rid of that, the excess blood and menstruation. So this is all about maintaining your energy stores. So your energy stores are a little lower. To maintain your energy stores and bring them back up, your body stops menstruation. So this is a negative feedback cycle. Think about it. You're trying to get back to homeostasis here. So this is kind of a tough question, but when you think about, ask yourself, are you trying to get back to homeostasis to maintain your body's energy source? In this case, yes. And if you're trying to get back to homeostasis, then it's always a negative feedback situation, okay? So this is, I'm just going to put, because I'm horrible at writing, a negative feedback situation, okay? Negative feedback. Okay. A runner, okay, as you're exercising and running, maybe you're training for, half marathon. And as you breathe more heavily when you're exercising, what are you trying to do, right? As you're breathing more heavily, you're trying to bring in more oxygen. Why do you need to bring in more oxygen? Because your muscle cells need that oxygen as the final electron acceptor, right? Because they are contracting and they're using more ATP and they need to make more ATP. So you need more oxygen. So again, as you're running and your muscles are contracting, the ATP levels are starting to dip. To bring those ATP levels back to homeostasis, you need more oxygen, right? To bring more oxygen to those cells to make more ATP. So again, you're maintaining homeostasis here. So if you're maintaining homeostasis, what type of a feedback mechanism is it? Got it, negative. Negative. I feel so weird talking, saying you got it when you're not here, but it's the best we got, right? So hopefully you got negative feedback there. So so far that's negative, negative. This was just kind of a goofy, I don't really like this one. I would have given you the labor one or blood clotting one, but I already gave them two. But lower unemployment causes an increased labor cost, which raises the prices on goods, causing inflation, which causes wages to increase more, which leads to increased inflation. So this is obviously an example of positive feedback because, again, when you're talking about the stimulus leads to more of a change, which leads to more increased inflation instead of bringing you back, right? So anytime that you're getting farther away from homeostasis, it's positive feedback, okay? Okay, so homeostatic imbalance, again, when we have a major disturbance of homeostasis, this is when we have disease, okay? So a disturbance of homeostasis, especially for a prolonged period of time, it makes you susceptible to disease. And this, it also is part of what contributes to our changes associated with aging, because our control systems just become less efficient at maintaining homeostasis as we get older. If negative feedback mechanisms become too overwhelmed, then destructive positive feedback mechanisms can take over. And so this can lead to things like heart failure, again, as we have too many destructive positive feedback systems take over. So disease is a more specific term kind of that we use usually for like an illness that's characterized by certain, set of signs and symptoms that we can recognize. But again, oftentimes this disease is created by a homeostatic imbalance. So again, disease is just a term that we use. It's again, it's an illness characterized by a certain recognizable set of signs and symptoms. And our signs are objective changes that a clinician can observe and, more importantly, measure. So when we talk about signs versus symptoms, signs are things that you can measure. Something like a fever, something like a rash, you can visually see that change. Versus a symptom, symptoms are subjective changes in body functions that aren't really apparent to, your clinician that's making the observations. So maybe things like a headache or nausea, tingling, in your fingers, things that you can't, necessarily always measure. Okay, so we're going to stop here because I know that this lecture went a little long. It always does for this first lecture, and then I'll get into some of the basic anatomical terminology. So I'll do a second part to this lecture. Please let me know if you have any questions. I'm going to tell you this early on because it's most important for you taking this course as an online course that you get the help that you need early on. So if you are confused by any of this lecture, if some of it just didn't make sense, if you're like, whoa, this was just too fast, please reach out to me. Please contact me. I want to help you, and I want to help you early on so that we get you on the right track. Because this course, again, is not only going to set you off on the right track for 201 and the rest of 201, but also the rest of 202. And of course, I want you to be successful. I teach, as you guys know, I teach at the community college because I like teaching, and I would be happy to not have a single student fail my class. I would be so happy because I want you to be able to learn this information and move on into the careers that you would like to move on to. But of course, we have to make sure that you learn the information. And my goal is to help you with that. So I am here for you any way that you need. Please reach out to me if you have questions. All right, and then we will see you back for the second part of this lecture. It's just the anatomical terminology stuff. All right.